Alright, 4.4. We need to remember to find an angle that is not an acute. We must create our right triangle in the quadrant that we're going to be at and label our points as X and Y and draw the reference triangle. So what this means is that if I'm not in my first quadrant, because that's the only place that's going to be acute, I'm going to be in quadrant 2, 3, and 4. I need to make my right triangle based on the X and Y values and then find my trig functions accordingly. So if I'm at negative 3, 4, negative 3 on the X, 4 on the Y, that is my triangle. The origin to the point is always your hypotenuse. Your angle is always between the hypotenuse and x-axis. Always, 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 always. You're always going to make your right triangle that way. So we know our x value, we know our y value. We need to use Pythagorean theorem to find our hypotenuse. And we should find it as the value of 5. I mean, you should recognize the 3, 4, 5 triangle, but if not, use Pythagorean theorem. Then, when I find sine, cosine, and tangent of my angle, and my angle is always, again, x-axis hypotenuse, I can then set it up 4/5, negative 3/5, negative 4/3. When we do this, make sure we watch our signs. And just, we should know this, but in case, our hypotenuse is always positive, because anytime I square something, it's a positive, square something, it's a positive, so two positives make another positive. All right? So always make sure your hypotenuse is a positive. Watch your signs. All right? This has to do with your SIGNs of your trig functions in all 4 quadrants, which you should know just based on the x's and y's. If I'm in quadrant 1, all x values and y values are positive. Y is positive, x is negative in quadrant 2. Y is negative, x is negative in quadrant 2. Quadrant 4, y is negative, x is positive in quadrant 4, and then the tangents correspond to our x's and our y's. So you should know that just based on what x and y is positive, negative in each quadrant. Alright, so given that tangent is negative 5/4, so if tangent is negative 5/4, this is either quadrant 2 or quadrant 4. See, tangent negative, tangent negative. So you have to have this other piece of information. If you don't have the other piece of information, you can't do this problem. They're telling you cosine is greater than 0. So that means cosine positive. Cosine are our x values, so that means quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. So which one do they share? We're in quadrant 4. You are going to be required to make a triangle in the proper direction of it. So quadrant 4 means my triangle looks like that piece. There's my angle where it's opposite over over adjacent, or y over x, sine over cosine. I don't care how you want to think about it. Do Pythagorean theorem to find that the hypotenuse here is the square root of 41. Do your Pythagorean theorem. Figure it out. So then it says, what is sine? Well, sine is opposite over hypotenuse. You can't have radicals in the denominator, so simplify it. And same thing with secant, sorry. Secant is with cosine. So we're going to find cosine first. which is adjacent over hypotenuse. And then secant is the reciprocal of it. So square root of 41 over 4. Make sure you're careful of your signs, SIGNs. Sine is negative in quadrant 4. Secant is the cousin of cosine, so if cosine is positive, the cousin is positive. Okay. Evaluate the sine and cosine functions at the 4 quadrantal angles. Quadrantal, so there's 1, 0, 0, 1, negative 1, 0, 0, negative 1. Remember, sine are your y values, and cosine are your x values. So go through them. There you go. Cosine, sine, cosine, sine, cosine, sine. 0, pi over 2, pi, and 3 pi over 2. Whenever we have our greater than 90, which we already talked about, we moved it into a quadrant. What we're actually creating are called the reference angles. And it's always going to be the terminal side, aka hypotenuse, and the x-axis, of which we already talked about. So every time you end up in quadrant 2, that's your triangle. Quadrant 3, there's our triangle. Quadrant 4, that's going to be our triangle. And our reference angle is always going to be subtracted from or added, depending on where you're coming from, whatever that x-axis value is. So let's look at this. If I'm at 300 degrees, first of all, I need to know that 300 degrees is there. That means my reference angle is what's left over. Well, if I know this is 300 of it, and this little piece would complete my circle, it would be 360 minus 300. My reference angle is going to be 60 degrees. And I'm gonna call it something. I'm gonna call reference angle alpha. Okay, so now I have 2.3 radians. There's no degree symbol. That means it's radians. Well, I know pi is 3.14. So I'm somewhere in here for 2.3 radians. So I want the leftover. So it's pi minus the 2.3, so 0.841 is alpha. All right, last one, negative 135 degrees. Negative, there's negative 90, and negative 135 is here because I know this is negative 180. So negative 135. I want what's left over, what's remaining. So I want 180 minus the 135, and I get 45 degrees. Our reference angle is always the difference between hypotenuse and x-axis. The reference angle is always the difference between the hypotenuse and x-axis. I mean, that's what we wrote up here, but just to re-clarify that. The reference angle is always the difference between the hypotenuse and the x-axis. Alright, to find trig functions at any angle, once again, we're going to find the reference angle, of which I'm going to call alpha. And depending on the quadrant, you must be careful of your SIGNs, your positive negatives. So when you are doing this, you're first going to find your reference, then you're going to find your SIGNs based on the quadrants here. So 4 pi over 3. Pi over 3 is 60 degrees. We want 4 of them, which is 240 degrees, or if you can count out pi over 3, 2 pi over 3, 3 pi over 1 pi over 3, 2 pi over 3, 3 pi over 3, there's 4 pi over 3. That's 4 pi over 3. Its reference is pi over 3. And it's in quadrant 3. So what is the cosine of pi over 3? Well, that's 60 degrees. 60 degrees is negative 1/2. Remember the x value, quadrant 3 is negative. Okay, negative 210. Negative 210 is about there. So 210, 180 means that the reference is 30 degrees. So if I want tangent of 30 degrees, I'm in quadrant 2. Tangent 30 quadrant 2 is negative. And again, these are values you should already know, is root 3 over 3. 11 pi over 4. 11 pi over 4 is going to put me in quadrant 2. And it's going to put me at pi over 4 as my reference, which is the same as 45 degrees. Now cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. So if I know sine, which is my y values, which are positive, is root 2 over 2, then I know cosecant is the reciprocal. Know your quadrant, know your SIGNs, know its reference. That's a huge component of 4.4. You need to know what quadrant you're in, so be able to make a triangle. You need to know your reference angle. You need to know your quadrant SIGNs, your signs of positive, negatives of cosine, sine, tangent, cosecant, secant, cotangent. Okay, let's look at another example here. If I know my angle is in quadrant 2, so quadrant 2 looks like this, and my sine value is opposite over hypotenuse, I do Pythagorean theorem to find out that missing side. 3 squared minus 1 squared gives me the square root of 8, which is 2 root 2. Do Pythagorean theorem, figure it out. Then what is cosine? Well, it's adjacent over hypotenuse. But it's in quadrant 2, it's negative. Tangent is opposite over adjacent. So 1 over negative 2 root 2 gives me negative root 2 over 4. Multiply by your root 2. And that's where the 4 comes from. Watch your sign. Use the calculator. If it is a major, just punch it in. If it is a cousin, remember to do 1 over the major. And always be careful of your mode. This is a degree. No little circle. It's not degree. You got to change your mode. So cotangent is 1 over tangent. 1 divide tangent. 4 decimals is fine. Change your mode. Sine is a straightforward -7. Make sure 4 decimals, round appropriately. So majors, you just punch in. Cousins, you need to reciprocate. Make sure you're careful of the mode that you're in. All right, here I have tangent of my angle. So that means I'm going to be doing inverse. But I need to be very, very careful. This is a positive value. If I am in the whole circle, that means there's a tangent value positive in first quadrant and a tangent value that's positive in the third quadrant. I'm going to have 2 answers here. The first one is easy. I just punch it in. Second tangent, 4.812. That will give you your quadrant 1, and your calculator always defaults to quadrant 1. 3, 6, 5, 9. But in order to get, so that's this value. In order to get this value, I have to add, oops, sorry, from here to there. Not this part. I'm adding 180 degrees, or because we're in radians, I'm adding pi. So quadrant 3 is from the terminal side to terminal side, 1.3659 plus pi, which is 4.5075. And that's 4.4.